So, welcome everyone to the next IITE seminar, and today it is our very own Géza Meszéna giving the talk. He is one of our organizers, so he's behind the effort every bi-week, I guess, to get this talk going. If you don't know Géza, he has a book that he's co-authored with Liz Pastor and a few others, and I believe Liz is also in the audience. It is an ecology textbook, but particularly focused on making it a bit more theoretical and trying to derive classical results of ecology from first principles that they call Darwinian principles. It's called theory-based ecology. I highly recommend it, but I will not take up more time. So Géza, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I have a very regular lecture. I want to raise some points for discussion, and for as an introduction, I want to tell you that I have lots of friends working in empirical ecology, and they know tremendously lot about the different kind of species, what are they doing, what way they interact, and so on and so on and so on. There's an endless knowledge, and in the same times, I often feel that they are very, very naive about the behavior of such a complex systems. And I often feel that the theory doesn't really help them. This is the connection which I try to tell something that starting from the point that most of our knowledge in biology is qualitative knowledge, who is who and so on. And it's generally very difficult to measure so many parameters of the ecosystem and produce good quantitative predictions. And so we want to understand the whole things essentially qualitatively. This is the goal, and somehow the theory should support this. And the question is, what kind of theory should do this job? And many people don't really feel that theory is useful because it's oversimplifying the very, very complex nature, and you never know what whether the assumptions are correct, and so on and so on and so on. You probably heard this many times, and one can argue that any argument can be based on models. So something wrong here, but when we look for the empirical ecology, which is not based on theory, then it's often they try to test very, very naive hypotheses, whether in coexistence theory, whether the similars or the difference coexist better. There are the famous studies about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis or the productivity diversity relationship. Some say that this is positive, or they finds it to be a negative. So they assume that it's unimodal, and so on and so on. And what they find after so many works that that anything can happen. So something missing here. And I think the most important problem is that theoretical ecology has remained a set of independent models, which with different assumptions and different outcomes. And of course, it's obvious that the assumptions are different and the conclusion different. And then and this is why it is not often convincing. So what I would like to do in my whole career is to develop consistent theories and the coherence of the thinking, including the coherence for the intuitive and qualitative understanding. This is, of course, not easy, and what I can imagine as a ideal is to have a ladder of the different levels of specificities, very general levels and more specific one. For instance, a few weeks ago, Mark had a lecture which has I think, one level lower than my favorite level, but I was very happy with this exactly because I believe in this kind of ladder. And specifically in this theory, in the old times, there was the Gauss principle of limiting similarity and Volterra and the Hutchinsonian space, and it was very nice, but sooner or later, people started to debate what are the niche axes and what is the niche space, and they cannot agree on Gauss principle and find that the Lotka-Volterra is too simplified, and the more mechanistic model didn't lead to anything general. So it's somehow fallen apart. But more recently, there are many approach to consolidate this field. The weak limiting similarity, by I think it was suggested by Peter Abrams, state that we don't have to look for a strict limit of similarity between the coexistence, but the more similar they are, the more sensitive to the parameter choices, something like that. The modern coexistence theory, Chris talked about not long time ago, which came essentially from Chessons and the storage effect, and the main point is to study the invasion. Some other people, led by Matthew Leibold, suggested what they call contemporary niche theory, which is related to the original niche concept, but something else, and it is not really connected to the modern coexistence theory. And meanwhile, people talk about niche as a vague idea and use this term, but it is not really connected, neither the modern coexistence theory nor the contemporary niche theory or anything else. So still there are approaches which are looks very different. This is the original and at least for me beautiful picture that there are some space of all possible variables, whatever it means, and the species somehow partition this space, and they don't outcompete each other if they live separately in this space. Of course, the original idea is that if two species live in different places because of the different temperature preference, then of course they will not compete with each other, but they also will not compete if they eat something different. So this kind of two kind of niche axis, which is one of them is related to the location in space, the another one is not. And this was the picture and the model behind from MacArthur Levin's was such that one of the necessities and research utilization function, and they assume that the competition coefficient is the overlap integral of this research utilization function. This was just an assumption, and this was a very good picture in which people could think about it, but as soon as they started to debate the what is the definition of the niche space and why this is the equation, then that story somehow ended. The generalization in which I can think in is the following, that instead of studying invasion, we studied a small perturbation of the system. Then, of course, everything can be linearized in a small perturbation, and the dependencies became so simple as a Lotka-Volterra in a generic way. So this is the Lotka-Volterra type of growth rate dependence of the species abundance, but it can be arbitrarily nonlinear, and for small perturbation, I can define the competition coefficient as a partial derivative. And of course, I can do this even if the interaction is not competitive, because this derivative exists and it may not be positive. And this was the assumption by MacArthur and Levins, that the overlap, so I wrote it with summa, overlap of the research utilizations gives the A, but if this is the definition, and the effect of the density to the growth rate goes through some regulating variables, then it is just a chain rule, and it is the dependence of the growth rate of the regulating variables, and this is the dependence of the regulating variables on the densities, and that's simple, and it should be true. So regulating variables is any ecological variable, environmental variables, which is affected by the populations, and which also affects the populations. And then I call the sensitivity and impact the summation of K in vector notation is just this. And I just said that the Lotka-Volterra model is just general for small perturbation. And for the small perturbation, no bold means the vectors, and then this is the perturbation, and of course we have here the inverse of the this interaction or competition matrix, which of course the determinant should not be zero and should not be too small, because if determinant is small, then the sensitivity, a small perturbation in the environment will give us a very large change in the densities, and a very large change soon will include the extinction. So the essential condition of coexistence is that determinant A should be large enough, and of course, when it goes to zero, then this sensitivity increases, and it will be very easy to go extinct. And this is exactly the weak limiting similarity explained in a top level, very simple mathematical argumentation. as opposed to find separately in each specific model. Unfortunately, this is not that simple because the populations can have a structure, or it can live in an inhomogeneous situation or in a fluctuating environment, but and then this feedback operate in a very complicated way that the populations are characterized not only by their size, but their spatial distribution, age distribution, the way they follow the fluctuations, and of course the regulating variables may be different in different locations, may be different in different time instant of time, and so on and so on. The whole things can be very complicated, but I always can say that if can adjust some kind of dilution or in a chemostat specifically for each species or an extra mortality, I can measure everything as a function of this extra mortalities and the population sizes, which are some average densities, are a function of this one, or I can inverse this dependence, and I can say that this extra mortality, which makes it an equilibrium, which is actually a kind of growth rate, depends on this population sizes, and then this formally, I will get back in this situation. It can be very complicated, but in principle, the very same structure will work, and in the very end, weak limiting similarity will remain intact. And of course, if two species have the same sensitivity or similar sensitivity or similar impacts, then a determinant will be near to zero. So this condition effectively says that both of the sensitivity and the impact factors are sufficiently different in the linear sense, that they are linearly independent, and this is the actual requirement of coexistence. Here are the complications. Here are the complications. You know this and worked on this a lot. That when I said that the population sizes are the averaged population sizes along the location, the time, and in physiological states, and so on, some kind of unified measure of the population level. But of course, it doesn't matter how the populations are distributed in space or in anything. And then if we take into account the cumulative effect, then we will find that the impact of a population. Okay, what was the impact? Impact was the essential this one. So I increase one of the population size and ask how much the regulating variables will change. But of course, meanwhile, the distribution will change also. So that this change will be different from the trivial one, and this difference is denoted by age, and is a pretty complicated matrix. And also this is the direct impact which you can imagine intuitively, and this is the emergent impact, and this is a complicated matrix, so the competition coefficient essentially this, and the determinant of this should be large enough, and the determinant of this is large enough, and the H is so complicated that it is not advised to try to calculate actually. However, if you know how the determinant works, if the H is something which determinant of which is not close to zero, and it generally don't have any reason to go to zero, then the conclusion remains that the sensitivity and the impact vector independently should be sufficiently different for the different species. So just we hide all of the very complicated situations here into this matrix, and the conclusion about weak limiter similarity and the connections to the differentiation in the species between the species just remained intact. And then, of course, then the correct definition of the niche space is that the each point of this niche space corresponds to one of the regulating variables. For instance, a given point is the, for instance, if I talk about resource limitation, then the resource concentration of this size at the location with this temperature, this variable, this is a point. So not the variable is not an axis, but the index of the variable. So the this is the food size is the temperature. This is the this space, and the segregation, actually the segregation both that in the dependence on these variables and the impact. So actually there are two kinds of partition in the niche space, which is generally not independent. No, so the specific formulas are very complicated, and you can find it in the papers. And then okay, I want to talk about the more specific things, because this is the point. You know, about the fluctuation, Hutchinson's theory is the leading candidate for the handling coexistence by fluctuation, and then this storage effect, the invasion based, and this is the founding theory of the modern coexistence theory. The general impression is that it is not really intuitive, and people don't see it as something which would form the intuition. Peter Adler and others check Hutchinson's conditions in coexistence of prairie places, and they find that this and this and these conditions will be okay, and then and Hutchinson's theory on that grasses was confirmed, which is not a surprise, because this was just mathematically derived conditions, but they are all also has a intuitive understanding what this grass is doing on the prairie, and actually different they use resources in different periods, and in this sense they are segregated. So in some sense, intuitively, missegregation, but it is not explicit in the theory. Yuri Barabás has a deep analysis of the precise version of the Chesson theory, and it's a very interesting one. It's pretty difficult reading. Of course, the problem is also difficult. With Kalle Parvinan, we did a model in which in a meta-population settings, there are local catastrophes of the superpopulations, and then there is a succession to repopulate the patches. And in such a model, it was clear that because of the succession in a competitive competition colonization trade-off, it is possible to coexist for different species, which is interesting because this kind of setup usually presented as a falsification of the NIST theoretical approach, because it is in a non-equilibrium situation, not the best competitor will live there always. But in the meta-population context, this is a absolutely well-behaving missegregation, that there are the ruderers who will find first the empty patches, and there is the case strategist who occupy the old patches, and so on and so on. Yuri developed a missegregation theory for a cyclic environment. Sorry, I wanted to write cyclic here, not fluctuating. A cyclic environment, sorry, Yuri. The point is that it's, of course, it is so complicated. It is so, not exactly, this is a formalism, but of course it is so complicated. But the very end, the very simple situation is that in the cyclic environment, seasonal environment, in every time point in the cycle has a limiting resource, and then there is a missegregation between the limiting resources in the different seasons. It is a very regular missegregation which goes that a cyclical environment. And now we are working on the same theory, which is not in a cyclic environment, but a randomly fluctuating environment, and we haven't convinced yet ourselves about all of the complications, but we take care about this. But what I want to say is that, of course, any mathematical model of fluctuating environment is very complicated. But the very end, what we will see is something which a biologist can imagine. Some flowers reproduce in early spring, some flowers in the late springs, and they don't compete with each other when they are resource requirement is the largest. And of course, they have should survive the non-optimal period. Also, this is the storage. So this is a very transparent issue. Of course, mathematical description is not that simple, but it has a consistency with the intuitively clear things. If we have a metabolic network, which we don't have a paper in it yet, assume that, for instance, fishes, they eat each other, and then each fish has a preference for size of the prey. Usually the larger eat the smaller, of course. And then what are the regulating variables? Of course, the resources and the predations. So the each size class is a kind of resource, the biomass in this size class, and also another set of regulating variables are the predation pressure on each size class separately. And of course, because of this kind of regulation is related to the species itself, in principle, arbitrarily large number of species could coexist even on a single resource. But of course, they should be regulated differently in the very same way as usual. If not only the size matter, but also the color, then you have to take into account. So this kind of way we can think about them as segregation. Now, one of my favorite example, the rainforest, I try to take a look of many rainforest book to understand what is happening in the rainforest. And I found nothing else than a long empirical enlisting of the beautiful trees and birds and everything. And this book, the Turner book in 2001, was the only one where they looked for the empirical axis. They didn't dare to call it niche success, because the niche is something nobody knows what is it, but they found two empirical axes. Was the height of the tree, and another is the pioneer climax axis in a gap dynamics if the tree dies. And the two, Koyama in 1993 made a model of exactly these two axes, the coexistence of the trees with different heights and position in the gap dynamics. And a third thing is that we learned from Rafael Andrea in a seminar, it's 3 years ago. It is a soil heterogeneity. So people know about three different essential segregation. And if I assume that there are 4 canopy levels, this is a good numbers. Assume that the pioneer, there are 4 successional stages in the pioneer climax axis. This 4 is just, I don't know. And I assume that we have 4 different soil types, I don't know. Then, of course, it would immediately can explain more than 100 niches. Of course, this is not a realistic description of a tree. It's in the forest, I do know. But I try to say that if we believe that the it should have a niche segregation structure, then at least a part of the niche segregations are already known. And we should not consider diversity as something mystical. And I assume that I said already that people were interested in the productivity, diversity relationships, and nothing came out of it. So in some sense, it is trivial that large diversity requires large primary production because everybody needs a minimal level of resources. So you cannot, so many species will need many different resources and so on. So diversity should depend on primary production, the niche segregation possibilities, and also evolutionary time. This is also trivial. They will not find that the dependence, positive dependence of primary production when there is no segregation possibilities, and of course, in some sense cases there is a negative dependence when the population, the community is overloaded and undivided resource, and then single something will outcompete everybody else. So primary product, and this is it. This should things have to be considered together, and then it is not that surprising what is happening. But of course, this very complicated things, it cannot be proven by doing some statistics on the field without being interested in on the details. And my main question, for which I hope an answer, but not I cannot be sure, that for each ecosystem we will be able to find the main ways of niche segregation, which will help us to understand. And I think this doesn't exist because people don't believe that this is the things they have to look for. They don't believe it because the general impression from theory and everything is that everything is so complicated, everything is cannot be modeled. There is a competitive exclusion in some model, but not another one, and so on and so on. And then they just don't believe it, that they have to figure out the niche segregation, and the niche segregation essentially the segregation with the respect to the regulations. So this is my hypothesis or question whether you can believe in this. And this is and this is the summary page that this kind of top-level theory integrate. This is, I didn't, actually this kind of niches for which the species adapt for, so it's related to evolution. I didn't talk about this. This intuitive, of course, it can be specifically modeled, and the Mark lecture modern, more specifically the symbiotic interactions, and the need for that kind of modeling comes from the fact that it's non-trivial whether how the symbiont really help or not help each other in different situations. So it is essential to this kind of modeling, and there is no, and then the job remains that people who has this job have to figure out the things in the real world, because theoretically the only things which can be said is that in principle we need some regulating variables which can be anything. So somehow we have to figure out, and my hope is that it can be figured out for each kind of ecosystem separately, but very generically within a kind of ecosystem. This is my guess. And this is the book which Julie already advertised, but I cannot resist to advertise. But also, Liz here, she was the main author, and the cover was from Oxford. Very nice picture with the turtles, I think, in the Galapagos. And yeah, and this is the people with whom I wrote the book. The adaptive dynamics community was my another company to inspire me, and this is a partial list of my former students or current students with whom I think all of that. That's all. That was it. Thank you for.
Thank you so much, Géza. And let's open for discussion. I have to say that because I unfortunately have to leave in just a few minutes, I will pass down the duties and the joy to Chris to moderate. But maybe can I begin with a thing that may or may not spark a discussion? So can I start playing devil's advocate here? You know, Géza, I'm sold. Yep, I can believe this picture. That's all good. If we go back for a moment to the slide where you summarize your rainforest view.
Yes.
Exactly. So all of these opportunities are either existing or potential adaptations.
Yes.
And that makes all the sense in the world, of course. We understand the relationship between the two. But let's bring then the analogy with adaptation a little further. So we are all convinced that Darwin's theory is correct.
Yeah.
But does that mean that if we see some random trait out there in nature, do we know what its adaptive purpose is? I'm not a naturalist, but I would assume that our solid belief that Darwin's theory is correct in every case is based on well-selected, well-known cases, and there's very many of them, but it's still a tiny, tiny subset of all the examples that are out there. I imagine that for most situations, for most traits out there, we don't really know why they're adaptive and how they contribute to the success of a given organism. I'm wondering, just to play the devil's advocate, whether what you're suggesting here might run into some similar trouble. We see all the trees in the rainforest. We can be convinced that these axes of segregation should exist somehow, but what if they're so complicated that us puny humans will not be able to get at them any more than we can get at the goddamn adaptive role of most of those traits that are out there, which we have no idea about why they're adaptive. We know that they're adaptive, but we don't know why. So that's I guess this is a logistics / human mind problem as for is the human mind up to this task? And is human logistics up to this task?
One answer of mine is that some people who study biochemistry of single-cell organisms, bacteria, or not only, or sometimes eukaryotes, often has detailed models with the dynamical interactions of thousands of metabolites and thousands of proteins, and they works. And of course, it is done only for model organisms, and thousands of people worked on for decades to find this out for specific model organisms. And of course, in principle, we could do this in ecology, maybe a little bit more difficult, but of course, we will not have money, time, and interest to do this for all of the ecosystem. And what we can do is to study some of them and figuring out the most important things. And then if we find something important enough, then of course we can decide to allocate sufficient resource and so on. So, but these are the Turner book is a book about a huge empirical work. And of course, given in a rainforest to have different levels of canopies, it's something obvious. And the pioneer climax is obvious, and they spent a lot of time to study it. And then this is what you can do. Raphael investigated soil heterogeneity. I have no idea if fungi, mycorrhiza fungi, has a significant role in such a forest or not. Mark explained us that in principle they can maintain coexistence, but then I don't know if there is anybody studied it, whether it is really important in the forest. But if this is a suggestion, probably it would be possible to study. I don't know, Mark, what do you think about this? Of course, it is difficult, time-consuming, and you will not be able to do with all species in all ecosystems.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to go, so I'll let you continue the discussion from here. But thank you so much, Géza, and everyone.
So are there any questions from anybody else? To you can either just speak up or raise your hand in the chat if there's a bit of a queue. Oh, thought we'd lost Géza for a moment
then. Hello, I have a question,
Yeah.
and it's if, like in ecology, I learned the concepts of a fundamental niche and a realized niche of a species, and I was wondering how that fits in with the theory here.
The fundamental and realized niche actually the difference between whether the competitor is present or not. And anything which I said, I can do in presence of the competitor or not. In some sense, in this sense, it is included. But it doesn't have such kind of special importance because, of course, you can study these interactions in any combination of species. This distinction became important in the context of predicting the distribution of the species, for instance, along a temperature range, which may depend on the possible competitors, whether present or not. And this distribution question makes this distinction really important. In general, of course, everything depends on whether the competitors are present or not.
Thank you.
Bob, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Hey, Géza, thank you very much. That's great. And you ended with your book. I recommend that everybody buy a copy immediately, buy one for your friends, and then read it. It's a really great book that you and Liz and others put together. I've just sort of a general thought. I think the approach is very powerful and it's very useful as a kind of a abstract umbrella generalization covering lots and lots and lots of scenarios. And as you said, the devil is in the details, working out for particular systems, which is very challenging. But one thing you very quickly alluded to was integrating ecology with evolution. I was thinking back to your formula relating kind of a general interaction coefficient, A sub ij equals the sum of is sort of S sub I times I sub j, where the S sub I is the susceptibilities, and that's useful.
This is for that.
Yeah, that one right there. That's right.
Yeah.
So now this of course assumes that the trait of the species is relatively is fixed, but you could imagine. I could imagine at least that that you could have a set of equations that go along with this that talk about how rapid evolution in, say, body size or some other trait could reflect changes in the magnitude of regulatory factors, and then there could be a change in the regulatory factors due to a change in the abundance of a particular phenotype or whatever. So I was just wondering. Is kind of evolution kind of swept under the rug here, or is it something that could be an expansion of this? For instance, could you have dimensions that contribute to coexistence where a community is enriched because of kind of rapid evolutionary dynamics? And an old idea that goes back at least to, what's his name? He was at Pimentel, I think, at Cornell, 50 years ago, was that, when species are rare, if they're competing mainly with common species. And so selection on the rare species is mainly to deal with competitive interactions with the common species. The common species are competing with itself. And so that fluctuates over time, of course, depending on who's rare and common. So I would just like to hear you reflect a little bit upon how you could expand this or modify this or interpret this to include kind of ecoevolutionary dynamical dimensions.
My original background is the adaptive dynamics community, in which the main point was that the interactions between the individuals or species modify the fitness function, and of course evolution of species modify its own fitness function. And the main conclusion was that if somebody specialize a kind of research, for instance, then it will push down. It may or may not make it a fitness minimum instead of maximum, and then there will be a disruptive selection to speciate. And of course, it's a complex question that selection has to decrease the gene flow between two species. But the essential concept is that speciation is adaptive because somebody adapts to a research or niche which has not been occupied yet, and this is the advantage can eat the already loaded resources. And this is the essential connection.
Well, yeah, I understand all that, but let me so classic adaptive dynamics, there's a separation of timescales between the ecological processes and the occasional appearance of a mutant that either makes it or doesn't make it. What I'm talking about is when you can have more rapid evolutionary dynamics, as happens, for instance, the evolution of virulence between host and pathogens. And if that adds extra dimensionality to the system, which could potentially contribute to additional feedbacks in the world that could modify coexistence in interesting ways.
Yeah, the standard adaptive dynamics papers was written in with this connection of rare mutations, but my understanding is that these conditions is not essential. In a simulation, we never kept in that way. If there is a cloud of there is a distribution of the traits, then it will evolve toward a higher fitness and reach a peak or push it back, and then there is the disruptive selection to push them away, so that this rare mutation assumption is not really essential. I will send you some papers on it.
Okay, I have one other quick follow-up question. This is also thinking about a different aspect of how evolution relates to this particular formula. So if you look at the sensitivity measure, let's say how growth rate responds to an increase in resource availability. Well, that's a property of the species, which presumably reflects its evolutionary history and its current traits and so forth. And so that's the product of natural selection very directly on that species. And there's an interesting question of how selection will mold that. But the second term, the impact term, doesn't depend just upon the species. It depends upon the entire structure of the environment in which that species is embedded. So, you could have some circumstances where you increase the species and it doesn't affect very much a regulatory factor, because the regulatory factor is influenced by other species very strongly in its community, for instance. So evolution is squarely taking place on the left at the species level. On the right, it's still there, but there's a sort of a whole system attribute to the impact factor that I think is very interesting. That could lead to real differences among systems in kind of coexistence for the same set of species in terms of their sensitivities.
Yes. Saying the same in a more generic way, that the fitness, of course, depends both of the traits of the individual, the species, and the environment. The fitness gradient is determined as a dependence of the trait at a given environment. So it is just the sensitivity and not the impact part for a small evolutionary change. And of course, if the evolution takes place, it may or may not feedbacks through the impacts and modify the evolutionary process. But the instantaneous evolutionary pressure is determined by the sensitivities that you arrived in this.
Yeah, I agree with you with that. That's another way of saying what I was trying to.
Yes, exactly.
Liz, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Bob. I would like just to mention that the questions themselves can be problematic. So when you say that that whether what is the competition of or regulation of rare or common species in general, then the problem is that one species can be very common in one ecosystem and rare in another one. And a species can be regulated completely different ways in different habitats. So I think that when you just try to ask such a thing, then it will be no meaningful answer. Because as you yourself mentioned just before, that the impact or the sensitivities depend on the impact depend on the whole set of interactions within the community. You just cannot abstract away from the specific situation within a community, within an ecosystem. So that's my point here. Another point that Géza just argued that if you want to have a first view, then you look at the main niche dimensions, which somehow should be related to body size, just because this determines many interactions, trophic interactions in many cases, and also an insect community has got a quite independent mechanism to live together just because of their size, and mammals. Small mammals will be another branch, and so on. So it's so the question is that whether we have a systematic way to look at communities and start to disentangle the niche structure. There are systems. Either we start with very simple systems like the Galapagos and learn a lot about adaptation and on a single island, as the Grants did, because that system is extremely simple. And then you can learn a lot about actually the coexistence mechanisms. Also, this was not the focus of their research there. So there is one approach that instead of looking at a single island, then you just enlarge and look at the whole archipelago. And the other approach, that you just put the whole thing into a lab and then you work with some species, and then you look at the mechanisms. And then the third one, what Géza just mentioned, that you try to find some niche axes which just throw into different groups of the species, and then you look at a single group, and then within that you try to do the same thing again, something like that. I'm just thinking loudly.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you want to come back to that, Géza, or you Or...
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I'm just bringing out things I thought were worth further discussion and elaboration. I'm just thinking that the differences among systems that you're talking about, Liz, in terms of this formula right here, would be more likely on the impact side than the sensitivity side. Because you can imagine the same species is found in a variety of environments, and it depends upon resources and predator abundances in kind of the same way. But the context it's in may be different. So the impact it's having on those regulatory factors will depend upon the structure of the community, the presence of higher order interactions, so on and so forth. So So one might look for the context dependence versus the species dependence on the right versus the left of this formula. And again, it's a way of just sort of abstractly thinking about why you're seeing differences among systems. I mean, Géza, you were talking about tropical rainforests, but you know, there are forests, even in the tropics, that have very few species in them. They all have lots of strata, they have successional stages, and so forth. So all the same niche axes are present, but they only have a handful of species. The Mora forest of Trinidad and Guyana are like that, for instance. And so it's interesting then you get this great disparity in species diversity, but you seem to have the same set of rough niche axes according to that empirical study. And so is that history, or are there other subtle niche axes that you didn't take into account involving natural enemies, for instance, or whatever?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, fantastic. Are there any further last questions or comments or whichever? Then I guess we better round to a close. And so the next one's in 2 weeks' time, when William Campbell-Llanos, who's actually in the audience now, is going to be speaking about body sizes and trophic dynamics. So hopefully see lots of people in 2 weeks' time. Thanks.
Thank you, Géza.
Thank you.
Thank